Good evening and welcome. I am Terry Kay of the Jewish Grandparents Network. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for When Grandparents Get Cancelled and What to Do About It. We so appreciate that you made the time to join us. First, may I say a big thank you to Sarah Reed, our JGN colleague, who is helping facilitate tonight. Sarah has shared with us in chat how to turn on captions for those who wish to use that feature. A word about the recording tonight. We are recording tonight's session. However, because this is such a personal and a sensitive topic, we will show in the recording only the presenter, Rachel Hark, sharing her guidance, and no participants' faces or voices or information of any kind. We want to assure you of that. I also want to say thank you to many of you who submitted questions in advance. We will get to as many of them as possible. And now we are thrilled to welcome Rachel Hark to lead us tonight. Rachel is a marriage and family therapist associate, specializing in later adult life development, family conflict, and estrangement. Rachel holds a master's in clinical psychology with an emphasis in marriage and family therapy. As a mother of 5 and a wife of 20 years, Rachel brings both professional expertise and personal experience to her work. She is passionate about helping people navigate relationships and embrace the messy, complex reality of family life with compassion and clarity. Rachel, may I hand it over to you with all our thanks for leading us tonight.
Thank you, Terry, and hi, everyone. I'm very honored to be with you tonight. While the subject matter is decidedly unpleasant, and I know it's not easy what we're diving into, it is something that I work with often in my therapy practice. So I want to begin by saying that I hold very strong personal and professional convictions about the sacred and essential role that grandparents play within a family system. And not only is this role imbued with meaning, the research also supports it. We know that grandparents can have an enormously stabilizing and enriching influence in their grandchildren and children's lives. And so I'm a big team grandparent person as far as let's have grandparents more involved in lives. Let's figure out what's going on that acts as barriers to that, and let's help families to integrate more successfully with each other. But as many of you know, that this is not an easy task often, and these roles don't always unfold as we imagine them to. And so grandparenting brings an immense amount of joy, but also some of the most intense pain and grief that we've ever experienced. And if it's okay, Sarah, would you go ahead and throw up the slide for slide 2? I have a question that I wanted to begin tonight with everyone. I want to gently ask, what was your dream as a grandparent? What was your dream about becoming a grandparent?
Would you like us to put that in chat?
Sure.
Rachel?
Go ahead and
Thank
put it
you.
up in the chat. I'll give you a moment to just reflect on that. That I would be a great I would be a great role model to my grandchildren. Thank you. That my dream was to have my family all together. The unconditional love and being able to enjoy the kids. We were very happy. My dream was to be involved in my grandchildren's lives like my mother was. Lisa's dream was family together for Shabbat dinners. This question, I find it powerful because often the pain we carry is tethered to the dream that we had. We dreamed of sharing wisdom or passing on family stories, watching them grow. And when that dream gets disrupted or worse, denied altogether, it cuts very, very deep. So many dreams coming in here. I'll leave you all to read through those. Sarah, if you would do the next slide, please. So as a therapist, as said before, I work with families who are navigating conflict and estrangement. And now the title of tonight's conversation is When Grandparents Get Canceled. Um, the professional lingo for that is estrangement. And estrangement itself isn't new, but it has definitely taken on a new form, I would say, in modern Western culture. The word itself, estrangement, comes from two Latin roots, extraneare, which means to treat as a stranger, or extraneous, which means not belonging to the family. And for many grandparents on the canceled end of side, this is heartbreakingly accurate in its description. In my work, I define estrangement as physical or emotional distancing between family members, either by one's own choice or the choice of another. It's different than simply distance or kind of growing apart, where you would be happy to interact if your paths cross. Estrangement is more like an actual deliberate boundary. It's often put in place to reduce real or perceived anxiety, conflict, or tension. And it usually reflects a breakdown of trust, emotional safety, or shared values. And it often comes with an unspoken or spoken belief that reconciliation is unlikely or impossible. For many parents and grandparents, like, this reality, I think words honestly fail to do it justice for just how painful it is. And it's also deeply private. So there is so much shame and confusion and silence around this. So I'm happy to have all the public conversations I can have about this, because I think it's really important that we break through that level of silence and shame that too many parents and grandparents are really burdened under. A question, if you, well, actually, I'll start. Sorry, Sarah, I was going to say go to the next slide, but we're still good. A question that we often sit with to begin is how did we get here? What is going on? Like, what is happening with families right now? So I want to give a little bit of like a helicopter view conversation with you to begin about, like, how are we here? What is happening? Why are grandparents getting canceled now more than ever, it seems? And here's where we really brush up against a dominant, I think, one-sided narrative, one that I see clinically, but also in the media at large, social media in particular. And I see estrangement almost formed as a sort of ideology. And it is often presented as a form of personal empowerment. A term that comes up frequently is going no contact. That might be something you're familiar with or have heard. I'm going no contact, and for these reasons, I've decided to go no contact. And it's usually initiated by the adult child towards a parent or grandparent, and it's often a millennial or younger. The narrative usually sounds something like this: for the sake of my mental health, I have decided to go no contact with my parents. They were toxic. They were unwilling to take accountability or respect my boundaries. And they are unable to become the safe and supportive person that I need. And in this framing, the onus is entirely on the parent. They are seen as the problem, and the solution is for them to reassess, to atone, and to change. This is also where grandparents end up losing contact with their grandchildren, because we know in most cases of grandparent estrangement, it's not actually related to conflict between the grandparent and the grandchild. It's related to the grandparent and an adult child. They're the grandchildren's parents. So that's kind of how I'm going to be framing the rest of my discussion, is related to that. I know that everything that I say tonight, it's more broad. Every situation is unique. So some of it may apply, some of it may not. And I think what I hope you'll really gather a little bit from tonight's discussion too is that this one-sided narrative is so far from the whole story, as you might know yourself. As a family therapist who works directly with countless families navigating estrangement, I feel compelled to challenge this dominant cultural narrative, not because I think grandparents or parents are, holy saints who have done nothing wrong, and it's really the kid's fault. I don't believe in any of these one-sided narratives. I believe that estrangement is multifaceted, as is any family system. It does not reduce neatly into binaries of like oppressed versus oppressor, or abuser versus abused. And while it may feel that way, estrangement is rarely just a matter of miscommunication or stubborn personalities who are just unwilling to meet in the middle. It's a very complex social, relational, and even historically situated phenomenon. And it's often shaped by layers of intergenerational stress. So I'll pause there. Is everyone kind of understanding and tracking so far? Anything you'd like me to clarify? Okay. So estrangement often intersects with events like divorce, trauma, poverty, mental illness, substance use, domestic violence. It can also be triggered by major life transitions, times when individual needs and expectations clash. It's influenced by deeper relational dynamics like attachment, differentiation, which is a way of saying managing closeness and separateness as at the same time as individuals, and parenting styles. It sometimes third party alienation plays a role. For example, an ex spouse or an in law. There can be what we call non normative stressors. There's an unexpected loss, illness, disability, legal trouble that can destabilize families that are already under strain. And we even know that we are learning how what we call a stress pileup can happen often shortly before an estrangement occurs. So it's kind of like something in the relationship or the family system, it hits an overload and feels particularly vulnerable to crisis. So you add to that the unmet expectations or secrets or longstanding communication breakdowns, values clashes, or betrayals when someone um, departs from shared ideals. Estrangement can be driven by a desire for self preservation, it can be a bid for growth, or it can be enacted as a form of punishment for wrongdoing. Sometimes it's even inherited. So that's where a person cuts someone off who's been labeled the problem, even though they never really had firsthand knowledge of who that person was or what actually happened. We have a lot of cases of estrangement that were just inherited. From a sort of socio-political lens, there's Western culture's emphasis on individualism and autonomy and self-interest that deeply influences how we relate now as families. Parents often feel torn, in my experience. They are encouraged to step back, to avoid conflict, to respect their adult child's independence, even when doing so leaves them isolated and in pain. So I say all this to really emphasize that whatever one-sided narrative you may be hearing or feel like you're being force-fed or tempted to believe about estrangement, I urge you to set it aside. These situations are typically far more complex and they deserve thoughtful reflection, they deserve time, they deserve grace, and they deserve, you know, in my field, what I think is competent professional guidance when possible. Sarah, would you mind going to the next slide? Does anyone have questions on what I've said so far? So I do want to spend just a moment talking about this sort of socio-historic and political lens, because I want to offer up an observation on how Western values in particular often reinforce an adult child cutting off a parent or canceling a grandparent and failing to agree that relationships are really reciprocal in nature throughout the lifespan of an intergenerational family system. There's a bit of a perfect storm of cultural forces that are leading to a silent epidemic of estrangement in the West. So first, there's kind of the deeply rooted soil of Western individualism. And this isn't new, but I do think it sets a foundation. So we are very much shaped in the West by an ethos that centers the self. So self-determination, self-protection, autonomy, and increasingly kind of like a give no F's attitude. I think that's kind of the water we're swimming in. And therapists like myself, we are not immune to this. Dr. Bill Doherty, who's a researcher and a longtime therapist, warns in one of his books that any therapist who believes that they are neutral, we are likely just unconsciously reinforcing the dominant cultural values of the time and place we live in. So I think he's right on that. C.S. Lewis also said that every society has its pet virtues. So today I would say ours revolve around the self-protection, self-fulfillment, self-actualization. But often these come at the expense of maybe other crucial values such as loyalty, reciprocity, fairness, duty, legacy, unity, honor. And in this environment, there is a kind of moral high ground that is given to those who cut off their family members that they perceive as harmful, whether or not those perceptions have been critically examined.
Maybe now.
Are we good, Terry? I heard something there.
We just ask our friends to please stay muted, and then we will invite you to unmute when we ask questions.
And feel free to chime in if you want me to pause or answer a question. I'm fine to do that too.
Okay, thank you.
Another key influence that I think is at play in this form of estrangement that we see showing up in today's world is what social psychologist Jonathan Haidt calls safetyism. It's the belief that to be safe means to be free from discomfort. So emotional distress is increasingly equated with harm. And what once counted as sort of like feeling upset can easily now be labeled as emotional abuse. I just saw actually another video from a popular therapist who was claiming that defensiveness, if a parent is defensive, then that's emotional abuse. Now, obviously, I completely disagree with that. I don't think there's anything that supports that. And that defensiveness has a function, and yes, it can cause problems, but it's not immediately equated to emotional abuse. But I thought it was a very perfect example of what psychologist and researcher Nick Haslam wrote a research article on called concept creep. And that is when psychological language begins to spread into public discourse and begins to apply to a broader and broader range of experiences. So in this sort of expanded model, normal conflict or disagreement or defensiveness or difficulty becomes toxic, traumatizing, or dysfunctional. So we've really moved from safety meaning physically safe to safety meaning never emotionally uncomfortable. And I think this shift has consequences. More and more we interpret necessary interpersonal stress, the kind that calls us to a sort of growth and maturity, we interpret it as intolerable. And avoiding conflict is sometimes framed as protecting one's peace. But in many cases, this avoidance fuels anxiety, mislabeling, and a growing reluctance to tolerate the messiness that relationships, especially long-term relationships, requires. So we're seeing more and more now that whole families are easily dismissed as emotionally immature or broken or dysfunctional without deeper examination. I think that this cultural moment also reflects a sort of like victim identity where being wronged becomes a source of moral authority and social capital. Victimhood cannot be just a personal experience, but it's a social currency. And in this climate, anything that challenges our viewpoint can feel unsafe or invalidating, not because it's truly harmful, but because we've been conditioned to equate discomfort with danger. So I think that makes it harder in general to stay in tough conversations, to tolerate ambivalence, and to repair ruptures that happen in relationships. And those are all necessary things to be able to maintain intergenerational family units. So we're not just navigating estrangement, really, we're navigating a cultural moment that really rewards cutting off over working through. Does anyone have any questions on that? I feel like I said so much there.
Rachel, Sarah, could you just take down the slide for stop sharing for a second? There are quite a number of already questions and comments in chat, And
Okay.
they're more specific. So I think that you should continue with your overview, and then we'll leave plenty of time for
Okay.
questions. Again, we
Okay.
have many that came in advance. So
Right. I just want to make
back
sure
to
I'm
your
checking
overview.
in and not boring people, so it's wow, she's saying so much.
Do not worry about that. So
Okay.
Sarah, if you want to go ahead and share again. Thanks, Rachel.
So I'll say one last thing at this sort of helicopter view, we also have the rise of what's called social contagions via social media. So this refers to a spread of beliefs, emotions, or behaviors through a population, much like a psychological virus. On social media, it operates through repetition, emotional intensity, and algorithm. So when one narrative, such as estrangement, as empowerment, gets amplified, liked, and widely shared, it really gains legitimacy and influence. So over time, content that frames family discomfort as abuse or encourages cutting off toxic parents gets more engagement and therefore more visibility. It starts to create its own sort of echo chamber, where complex intergenerational tensions are really reduced to simple prescriptions, and often with little, you can just spend a few minutes on social media looking up anything like this, and you'll see that there's very little regard for repair, context, or family systems in general. And in this environment, estrangement ideology can really spread rapidly, particularly among younger adults who are seeking clarity or identity in their relational distress.
So Rachel, Lottie asks, are you saying that this generation today is more self-centered and this fuels the path?
I would definitely say that the focus is on self. That the self is what determines and navigates everything. If it makes me happy, if I feel truly fulfilled, that makes it right. That's maybe how I would think of it.
Thank you.
So if Sarah, would you move to the next slide, please? Okay, so I just really offered a very high elevation viewpoint, right? Sociocultural, psychological, and even kind of a little bit of historical context. And some of this may resonate deeply, or some may feel distant from your own lived experience right now. But my hope is just that this broader lens helps to shave off some of those sharp edges of shame, maybe soften some justified anger you might feel, and hopefully to reduce this sort of personal failure that we internalize as parents or grandparents if we find ourselves canceled by our children. Because the truth is, we are all swimming in forces that are bigger than ourselves. So, where does this leave your agency? What do you do with your specific circumstance, your particular rupture, or your longing for connection? So, I want to move towards offering a few frameworks that I have found help families move out of a combative, helpless stance into one of hopefully greater clarity and capacity and strategic wisdom. You may have seen on.
Rachel, could you just pause for a second, because one of our guests asked, could we put you on the screen? And I just want to point out that we have spotlighted Rachel on the screen, and the way to be able to see her more clearly is to go to the word view in the top right of your screen and click on side by side speaker, and then you'll see both the slide and Rachel.
Great. Okay. So as you see on the slide, I talk about fairness a bit. So I know that all of you already know this, that life isn't fair. And parenting at any stage was really never designed to be fair. And I realize that that might be a very hard truth, but I hope you'll hear me out on this. One of the great hopes that we carry that I think many parents carry as we age is that eventually our adult children will become more like peers, that they will be capable of mutuality and insight and some reciprocity. Others hope that their children will retain a certain level of respectful deference, a kind of honoring of the role that you have played. And when that doesn't happen, it is so deeply painful, and understandably so. But here's the rub, I would say, is that families are made up of people with conflicting needs. This is something I think every therapist would do well to provide a little bit more education on family systems. We are made up of people with conflicting needs, and there is rarely a configuration in which everyone's needs are met. Not all of the time, and not even most of the time. And this is something I believe that if we could educate more with families and even sort of set the stage with this, we might get a little bit further in our relationships. Um, Ambivalence is the norm in families, and ambivalence is the coexistence of seemingly opposite emotions. It's the love and frustration. It's hurt and it's hope. It's anger and it's desire for closeness. And as a parent, you're probably very familiar with these dualities that have existed inside of you as you have parented throughout your child's lifespan. I think it's really easy to reference kind of like those toddler years. They're so cute and they're driving you crazy at the same time. And you want to be close to them and you also want to just go away or like just give me a minute, but also stay close. All of those feelings kind of coexist inside of us all throughout our parenting experience. And parenting by its very nature is sacrificial. You give and you give and you give, hoping for some kind of a return, closeness, appreciation, shared holidays, time with grandkids. And when that doesn't happen, it feels like a huge betrayal. But I hope that parents will consider this. We routinely advise parents of infants to adjust their expectations about sleep, autonomy, and personal enjoyment. And why? It's because a child is undergoing necessary developmental processes, one that temporarily sideline the parent's needs. So likewise, we advise parents of teenagers that we need to offer them more grace, that teens probably need more grace than they deserve, right? The adolescent, the pushback, the rebellion, the withdrawal, it's not always disrespect. Oftentimes it's a developmental struggle of conflicting needs to establish a separate identity that they are undergoing. And it's one that's required for healthy adulthood. And here's the tension. When you have your teen's quest for autonomy that directly collides with your needs for some love or connection or some emotional intimacy, that's difficult. But in those stages, I think we have a reference point for where we advise parents sometimes to kind of pull back on their own needs or and understand that there's a growth process for their child that's unfolding and that it's okay to give them a little more space. And paradoxically, as a parent begins to reframe their understanding of this sort of teen rebellion as a necessary tension rather than a personal rejection, they often find that they're better able to stay connected to their teen on some level, even in the messiness. So I kind of take that same logic and carry it and say, we can't stop there. It actually carries all the way through adulthood with our children too. An adult child who's establishing a marriage, a home, a career, raising children is also undergoing necessary developmental work. And that work may directly conflict with your needs for connection and appreciation and validation. And that doesn't make your needs invalid. And but it does mean that continuing to maybe interpret the distance or tension as a personal affront or a personal rejection, it may only increase your suffering. So this is why I tell parents of adult children the same thing I tell parents of teens. I tell them that grace matters and that perspective really matters. And if you root yourself in a constant battle for fairness over how much time is spent, how holidays are shared, or how you're treated, you may end up locked in resentment, watching your relationships slowly deteriorate. So I know everything that I just said is a lot. And I also wonder if maybe there's a question of like, so you just accept that life is unfair and move on? Like, what are we supposed to do with this? Yeah, life, it's not fair. It sucks. So what? What are you going to do about it? And I don't think that's my full message at all. I do think that there's one piece that's a little bit of radical acceptance of the inherent unfairness of life, that when we are parents, we never really are guaranteed fairness. But I think more importantly, I'm really trying to offer a pivot. And this is where I encourage grandparents and parents to, rather than emphasizing fairness, I want you to think wisely. I want you to emphasize wisdom and strategy. I want you to think strategically and ask yourself, what is my goal? So if you're in conflict, if you have been canceled, if you're estranged, what is my goal? Is it to have access to your grandchildren? Is it to feel validated by your adult child? Is it to be understood and appreciated for your sacrifices? So, right there, I just listed three very different goals. And sometimes they don't work well together. And sometimes one kind of goal will undermine another. So, for example, a grandparent who, let's say, they have decided that their goal is really to have connection and access to their grandchildren, they might choose in that goal to overlook slights, to endure unfairness, and to avoid conflict, to preserve the relationship so that they can have a connection with their grandchildren. Another grandparent whose goal is to be more seen and more validated by their adult child might engage in more truth telling and difficult conversations that could increase the risk. It could increase the risk for distance from their grandchildren. So my loving challenge in these situations is really to get very, very clear about your goal and then ask, what am I willing to sacrifice? What am I willing to strategize on to move towards that goal? So when I work with estranged parents and grandparents in therapy, we often uncover that there were multiple goals operating all at once, and some of those goals are sabotaging each other. And so a desire for emotional intimacy with their adult child might be clashing with their desire for access to grandchildren. And a push for that more communication is actually creating more withdrawal. And so once we really clarify priorities we can design a wiser approach, and we can become more realistic about what's possible and more intentional about the behaviors that will move us closer to what matters most. Does that make sense so far, what I'm saying? Any questions? I'll check the chat. There's a lot of messages I'm using.
There are a lot of questions, Rachel, and many of them revolve around, the in-law, son-in-law, daughter-in-law, boyfriend, girlfriend. So we'll get, I'll try to consolidate those and we can get to them after you've finished your overview.
Okay. And the reason too, I really emphasize that you've got to clarify your goal. What's your goal? What's your goal? I'll keep working on that with the parent. It's also because it helps you reclaim something that often feels completely lost in family conflict, and that is a sense of control. One of the most painful transitions in the family life cycle is the loss of hierarchical clarity. It's the emergence of competing needs. It's the presence of new family members, like those in-laws, right? This often stirs up feelings of threat and loss, and our nervous systems respond the only way they really know how, which is kind of fight, flight, or shut down. So when we slow down and take full responsibility for our internal world and identify what is it that I truly want, you can start to rebuild a sense of your own personal agency. And I think that's where your strength really lies, and that's where healing can begin. Sarah, would you mind going to the next slide? So what about reconciliation? So if we are cut off or we are distant, what are the first steps? So let's assume that you have done some reflection. That you've gotten clear about your goals. You've allowed yourself to grieve what's been lost. There's a lot of grief in parenting and a lot of loss, and a lot of it what we call necessary loss too. There's just the pain of watching our children grow older and do things differently or need us less. And maybe now you're wondering, like, is there a way back or is there a way forward? So I'll offer a few thoughts here, not really as a formula, but more as a direction. Of course, the first is to know the goal. Is it a full emotional repair with your adult child? Is it having a chance to be a part of your grandchild's life again? Is it simply to be heard? Different goals will require different strategies, and sometimes, again, they're not all compatible at once. So we have to put them in an order of priorities. I highly recommend reading the book Rules of Estrangement by Dr. Joshua Coleman, especially his framework for writing a letter of amends. His approach is structured. I think it's compassionate. And most importantly, it is centered on what the adult child might be able to hear. A letter of amends isn't a confession of being a terrible parent. It's not an admission of guilt for things you didn't do. Instead, it's an act of humility and perspective taking. It's a way of saying, I can understand that you might have experienced things this way, and I would like to listen and examine my own potential blind spots. And I think that opening the door in that way, with that initiation, that invitation to come to the table so that you can listen, is one of the most effective ways to have an adult child be willing to return to work on possible reconciliation. There's another tool that I think is very powerful that I work with parents and grandparents on, and that is the ability to really take and absorb and be able to articulate your child's perspective. So I use an exercise called steel manning. I don't know if you've heard this in like philosophical debate forums, but there's a term called steel manning. It's the opposite of straw manning. So it's when I ask a parent to imagine their child coming to see me as a therapist, and I say, what would they say? And then I have you, the parent, articulate your child's point of view so well that if your child were listening in, they would hear it and say, yes, that's exactly how I feel. And that's a really difficult exercise actually to do. We find a lot of spots where there's gaps. We don't know, we don't have information, there's areas. And that to me is what we can bring for more questions and invitations to learn more with our children. So when we do that, even if it feels painful, unfair, or incomplete, in my work, we usually find a seed. I call it finding a seed in the garden of weeds. So that seed is often a small buried truth of some sort, something that you can acknowledge or give a half nod to. And that's where I begin. That's where we begin in our strategy. A common mistake that I see with parents, understandably so, again, I have so much compassion for how complicated this really gets on the ground. But a common mistake is that a parent begins hacking away at the weeds, kind of like there's this and no, that's not how it went. And so they're focusing on the weeds instead of that little seed that we have that we could begin to nurture and persistently cultivate so that it grows into something that looks like hope. It grows into something that looks like trust rebuilding. Another thing that I recommend to parents, and I know that some of you may believe that your child's therapist is playing a role in the estrangement, or that therapy in general has some sort of role and is implicated in some way in the estrangement epidemic. And you might be right. I have many of my own various thoughts on this one. But I think here's the reality to be strategic about. Therapy is highly valued in today's culture. You may have good experiences with therapy yourself, good or bad. But I think rather than resist it, if that is where your child is leaning, I recommend working with it. Again, it's good strategy. So one of the most courageous and relationally wise things I think a parent can do is this: offer to attend therapy with a therapist of your child's choosing. It's not because you have to believe their entire narrative, but it says something about, you know what, I am strong enough to sit in the room with your pain. I am strong enough to hear your perspective about me. I am strong enough to hear what you believe to be true. And in my experience, a parent's refusal to attend therapy or their unwillingness to sort of stay at the table when things get uncomfortable and to get up and leave upset and not return, it is one of the clearest predictors that the relationship will not recover. So I often say, first person to leave the table is going to be the one who quit and who stopped it. So let's stay at the table. Let's commit to return to the table. As messy as it might get, keep coming back to the table. It's fine if we need pauses. It's fine if we need, the emotional timeouts for us to come down from what we're digging up. But I really encourage parents, don't be the one to leave the table. Instead, as Dr. Coleman puts it, like look for the kernel of truth. It might be buried in unfair accusations or distorted retellings, but if you can find that kernel, focus on it, water it, nurture it. The plant that emerges might be slow growing, but it is a sign of life, and it is the beginning of rebuilding trust. And finally, I guess my last practical kind of strategy is to go slow. Estrangement is a trauma. It is a trauma for both of you, and reconnecting can feel terrifying, especially when there's fear of being hurt again, especially as a parent. You know, there's so much betrayal and hurt that this has even happened, or that it's gotten to the place where it is. So it's not uncommon for there to be cycles of re-engagement and withdrawal as we've tried to find solid footing again. And I think it's okay to not panic if the process feels very uneven. And I think that's more normal. And of course, I can't emphasize this enough, to seek professional support, competent professional support during this process. Reconciliation can reopen real wounds, and having someone who is skilled and separate from you in the room can help us to maintain some grounding. And you don't have to do it perfectly, you know, but you do have to be willing. And in estranged families, sometimes that willingness is the most powerful invitation of all. Right. Sarah, would you mind going to the next slide? Check the comments really quickly here just to make sure there's nothing I should. I heard Sherry say, "I am willing," and I will say, I hear that echoed over and over. Of course, there's so much willingness. That's why you're here tonight. There are parents that are willing, and they're trying to figure out what is the best way to try to reopen this or get them to come to the table. So my next one is, my next slide really addresses, so what happens when you've done everything right? Like, what happens and they still don't come back? You know, I've written a letter of amends. I've offered to listen. I've offered therapy. This happens. And this is one of the hardest truths I have to speak aloud. Some parents do follow every step I've laid out. Some parents write letter of amends. They offer therapy. They take responsibility. They'll stay humble. They'll sit in discomfort. They'll do the long, slow work of growth, but their adult child will not return to the table. And in my experience, I will say this isn't the norm, but it does happen. You know, I have more success than I have failure with this approach. So, you know, the practical strategies that I'm recommending. But I will say that when it does happen, and it hurts in a way that I think is very hard to put into words. Long-term estrangement creates what psychologist Pauline Boss describes as ambiguous loss. It's a kind of grief that lingers without resolution. It's like death, but without a funeral, without casseroles, without condolences. It's private and it's isolating, and it leaves you unsure of how to mourn what is technically still alive. And I believe that that kind of grief requires its own kind of care. So you do need support, and I can't say this strongly enough, you need connection. I recommend joining a group of other parents who are walking the same road. I recommend telling a few trusted friends who can hold your story gently, because you are in a kind of pain that is not easily healed, and it's certainly not quickly resolved. Eventually, many parents will find that they must shift in these circumstances from trying to reconcile to simply learning to carry the grief. And when that shift happens, the task changes. It becomes, how do I grow big enough to hold this? So it means asking, what is my grief showing me? What relationships need my care and attention now? What have I learned about myself, my own history, my wounds, my resilience that deserves to be seen and supported? And perhaps most importantly, given what's happening, who do I want to be in all of this? Sometimes one of the most courageous acts is not to chase, and it's to release. And that doesn't mean you are resigning. You didn't quit. It's a healthy detachment that says, I can't force this, but I can tend to my life. I'll finish actually with two stories actually from the Jewish tradition. The first is one of reconciliation. It's Jacob and Esau. You know, these brothers endured estrangement, betrayal, silence, and when Jacob returns, he's unsure of what to expect. He prepares for the worst, but what he receives instead is grace. Esau runs to embrace him. They both weep. The relationship was never the same, but it was something that was restored. And Sarah, I'm sorry, would you mind going to the next slide? I forgot to tell you that. And there's another story in our tradition, which is one of heartbreak. King David and his son Absalom. So Absalom rebels against his father in devastating ways. Their relationship is fractured beyond recognition. And David, while he emerges victorious, Absalom dies in the process. And David's grief is unforgettable. He actually says, you know, my son, would I died instead of you? And I think that that cry is one of those raw expressions of a parent's love for a child who could not or would not return. So these stories live side by side, and it is hope and heartbreak, it is return and loss. But we do see something that echoes the same truth. In it, the estranged, the parent keeps living. They grieve, they endure, they carry the ache, but they don't disappear into it. So I want to finish off my comments tonight by just leaving you with this question. If my child ever comes back, or if my grandchildren return into my world, what kind of a life do I want waiting for them? And if they don't, what kind of a life do I want to build for myself? I think that the beauty that you learn to build now in your relationships, your wholeness, your joy is not wasted. It is not meaningless. It is yours and it is very worthy. And I'm just thankful that you allowed me to kind of come and present and talk with you tonight. I will open up now to some questions that we've received. And Terry, if maybe you want to let me know where you want to take it from here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to try to consolidate the questions that came in advance because there are many in chat that are of the same on the same theme, and they relate to, they go something like this. I don't know what I did, so let me give you the wording. Something must have triggered this, but I don't know the reason. And I've spent countless hours trying to figure out why, and I'm heartbroken over it. So could you, isn't a question there, but I think the question is implied. I don't know how do I know what I did if they won't talk, my children won't talk to me?
Right. So when this happens, I will sometimes go back to the last points of contact with a parent, like what was happening around the time that they stopped talking. What do you remember hearing them say? Did boundaries come up? Did the word toxic come up? You know, once we get digging, we can kind of figure out and kind of create a context around it to develop some possible hypotheses. We can also look more deeply at what attempts at contact have been made and how have they been made. That's why I really stress the guidance of a letter of amends, kind of how Dr. Coleman formulates it, because sometimes in our attempts to reach out, we provide a level of unknowing defensiveness or explanation that further the child moves further away from. So getting a little bit of professional support and guidance on like how to reach out to maximize the chances that they will engage. We'll take a look at that too. And then also circling back to, could you even imagine, and just come up with whatever you can come up with me as their therapist, what they might say to me. And when a parent really pulls in, they sometimes can come up with a narrative. And then we'll contend with that and figure out, is there some validity there? Can we at least use that to join with them and have them hopefully join a conversation with us? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Then there were a series of questions along the lines of, our issue is that our son has succumbed to his wife in all ways. I'm looking at the screen because I've got the questions listed here. For example, we had a 50th long weekend and our daughter-in-law didn't show up and never called us to say she wasn't coming, nor did our son tell us. And similarly, another question, how do you reconnect with an adult child who has relinquished all control to his badly behaved wife to the point of cutting off your family from everything and moving and not even letting you know?
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that their child has cut them off and it's moved and hasn't let them know. Am I understanding that question?
It's more about when it's not your own child who's causing you, our
Yeah.
friends feel it's the partner, the spouse, the girlfriend, the boyfriend, the partner who is
Yes.
the source of the problem.
Yes. Okay. So and again, very, very common that there's a lot of tension when an in-law joins the family system. And I think that this is often because we have the emergence of the competing needs. A son is now in a position where he needs to form a trust and alliance with his wife. There's some real masculinity tests, I think, in there too, sometimes, of like you kind of got to prove to her in some way that you're loyal enough. And so as they kind of tend to that formation of their family and the prioritization of their things, it seems very, very heavy on like her influence. I suggest that parents do not actually put up a whole lot of resistance to that, that they work to understand how can we be perceived as safe by her. What is it that we can do to create a sense of trust and safety with her over time and give it a lot of time? I think sometimes we jump the gun early on within the first couple of years. There's some real blow-ups. There's things that we have a lot of conflict due to that nervous system response. We're going to fight, flight, or shut down, that can break trust early on. So I also think there are cases, though, where I think the term narcissism is so overused in general. I think it's one of those things that has undergone the concept creep problem that I talked about earlier, that we might be convinced, like, my son or daughter is married a narcissist, there's no hope here. I think more often than not, it's not actual narcissistic personality disorder at play. However, there are some times where it is, that it actually is, and they are with a spouse who is psychologically fragile in that way and needs all control and needs to feel like they can pull the spouse towards them. And that is very real when that happens. And it can be very devastating for families too. And so in those cases, I recommend reading, I like the chapter, again, Dr. Coleman, The Cult of One, I think is a good chapter to read on that one in the book.
For tonight, we are going to sign off with all our thanks to you, Rachel, and to our friends for joining us. You'll hear from us tomorrow. Please check in your spam folder by the end of the day, because often our emails go into spam. We'll include the recording, the slides. We've got a discussion guide with some thoughts for you, some prompts. What else? Some other stuff. So we're going to say good night now, and we thank you very much for joining us, and we send you from our heart all our good wishes.